Hello and welcome to the second episode of the Aquarian Age podcast. My name is Sunny Khan and I'm your host. Now I'd like to apologise for the sound quality of the first episode. There was a lot of audible tutting sounds from me and an aperiodic muting of the sound, which I don't know what caused that, but hopefully today, the 18th of January 2020, the recording will be improved, but if it isn't, then please bear with me until I can get to the bottom of it. So I'd like to start the show with a brief look at the celestial sphere and the prominent aspects at play as I record the episode. Now, for the last 3 nights, I've observed a beautiful waxing crescent moon hanging low in the sky in the southeast. So we're still in the period of the dark moon, but the moon has now moved out of union with the sun and is visible again in the sky. So you'll recall that I began this podcast when that union was a few hours from being exact. So this is a podcast very much tied to the lunar cycle. The sun has recently exited a 3-degree orb with Pluto, and is now about to enter Aquarius, where a lot of planetary energy is building. We have Saturn and Jupiter in the first decan, and Pallas Athena and Mercury in the second, with Mercury having recently entered its shadow. I think the big build-up of planetary energy in Aquarius, I was thinking about it as I was doing this podcast, has great significance for this podcast. And I think that's sort of happening during the first first quarter to first half of the year. I know that Venus is going to join towards the end of the month as well. We also have Mars and Uranus entering a 1-degree orb in Taurus at the moment, which is a potentially dangerous transit. And the Moon is also currently conjuncting Chiron in Aries. I think it might be a degree to waxing, a degree to orb. So 2 potentially difficult energies at play there. Though from the perspective of this podcast, they can also bring great motivation for the practice of yoga and insight or wisdom into our primal wounding. So by primal, I mean Adam and Eve expulsion from Eden kind of primal. Finally, we have Ceres conjunct Neptune in Pisces, which is also squaring their lunar nodes. And I think that has a lot of significance for this lunar cycle, and I think it will still be active in the next lunar cycle as well. So I think that's going to be quite significant for the next couple of lunar cycles. And the moon transited that conjunction yesterday morning while I was writing this episode. So that's the celestial sphere. Let's move on to the current episode. In the last episode, you'll recall that I gave some background as to why I've called this podcast The Aquarian Age. I spoke about the sorts of content I will be covering, and I also gave a brief introduction to myself. Now, in this episode, I want to talk about the goal of yoga, which is often referred to as moksha, liberation, or enlightenment, but is less well known as the attainment of direct seeing. The attainment of direct seeing. Now, their former terms, moksha, liberation, enlightenment, are loaded with an awful lot of hubris and baggage, and for that reason I avoid them completely. The attainment of direct seeing, on the other hand, has no cultural baggage associated with it, so it's a much better term to use. And it's also descriptively accurate. So in this episode, I want to give you a precise and down-to-earth description of the goal of yoga, which is the attainment of direct seeing. And before I do that, we are going to have a preliminary discussion about the Jungian notion of the archetypes, the psychoid aspect of the archetypes, and of individuation. And in fact, that's going to take up most of this podcast. With those concepts established, I can make the yogic attainment of direct seeing comprehensible. So that will be the podcast, split into 2 sections. The first section, a discussion of the archetypes, of the psychoid aspect of the archetypes and of individuation, and the second explaining the goal of yoga, which is the attainment of direct seeing. So let's begin with the Jungian archetypes, which is a topic that I expect everyone listening will be familiar with to some degree. In his collected works, Jung refers to a thought experiment which he had when he was forming his ideas around the archetypes. He contemplated the experience of a moth known as the yucca moth. Now, there are around 40 or 50 species of plants known as yucca, but the yucca moth is attracted to only one species, whose nectar it feeds on and whose flowers it pollinates. So a nice example of a symbiotic relationship. The question is, how is the yucca moth able to distinguish that one species from all the others? Okay, yucca plants are pretty much alike and very difficult to distinguish, and the yucca moth is certainly not a botanist. It's a creature of instinct. So it must be that in its psychic experience, that one particular species of yucca plant must be clearly marked out in some way or another. Similar to how in humans, for example, a potential mate stands out as attractive from among all other humans, despite the fact that all other humans look pretty much alike. So perhaps the yucca moth experiences the specific species of yucca as visually attractive, or perhaps it's the smell of the flower that is enticing, or maybe it's some other factor. But whatever it is, it's clear that the psychic experience of the yucca moth is structured in such a way that this particular yucca species bears a direct and meaningful relationship to the moth. So we have there a numinous archetypal image, okay, of the yucca plant in the psyche of this moth. Okay, now by the word image, it could be a visual image, what the actual plant looks like. It could be a tactile image of when you land on the plant, what it feels like. Or it could be an olfactory image of what the flower smells like. Okay, but whatever it is, there's an image of some sort that guides the moth to the plant, and then also once the moth has landed on the plant, there's a whole set of behaviours, feeding behaviours that unfold. So, and clearly this archetype is not present in other organisms. For example, in the psychic experience of the average human, we probably won't be able to identify one species of yucca from another, and they'll all look much the same, and they may even look the same as other genuses of plants. So clearly, our psychic experience, our conscious experience, is structured very differently. Now, there's that word structured again, the structuring of our psychic experience. So let's now be clear what I mean by structured, because this is a key step in understanding the archetype. So we have three factors. Firstly, some kind of archetypal image, which in the psychic experience of the organism is numinous in some way. In other words, it's charged with libido, so that it exerts some kind of unique interest to the organism. So, for example, a specific job or career may exert a greater interest on you than others. You may be interested in being a Jungian analyst, whereas you might not be interested in being a teacher. So we could say then that that specific job has some numinosity that the others don't have. And again, by archetypal image, we're not talking specifically about a visual image. It could be visual, but it could be tactile or olfactory or cognitive. Okay, so the word image is used in a much broader manner. So we have some kind of archetypal image in the psyche of the organism. Secondly, the archetype also has associated with it a set of behaviours. So these behaviours generally unfold once the archetypal image has been encountered by the organism. So for example, the yucca moth encounters the yucca plant guided by this archetypal image, and then once it's landed on there, the feeding behaviours unfold. Okay. Now these behaviours, these archetypal behaviours, may be very prescriptive, robotic or tightly defined, or they may be less prescriptive and open to more variation and creativity, and depending on the context. So for example, human archetypal behaviours are generally of this latter type. We're not robots, you know, we're quite free in our kind of behaviours. Thirdly, also associated with the archetype is a whole set of subjective states. So we're not just talking about behaviours that unfold, there are subjective states that go with that. These can be emotional, feeling, cognitive, subjective states. So, for example, in humans, reading a book can spark cognitive states such as thinking. It can spark emotional states. Or in the yucca moth, once the yucca moth has found its yucca plant, we can imagine that it's going to be feeling quite pleased with itself and contented. So those are subjective states. So the archetype structures the psychic experience of the organism with archetypal images, associated behaviours, and subjective feeling or cognitive states. The structuring of experience is what is critical, for it's that Jung noted as a key property of an archetype. And all organisms, I say all organisms, really I'm talking about organisms with a psychic experience. I don't know about bacteria, for example. So all organisms with a psychic experience have an archetypal inheritance, because that psychic experience must be structured in some way. And it is the differing archetypes and organisms that give rise to their differing experiences of reality and their differing behaviours. Now, in the case of the yucca moth, we could just call it the yucca instinct rather than the yucca archetype, okay? But to understand why the term archetype was coined and the central importance of the archetype in the human psyche and in the process of individuation, let's now turn from the yucca moth to the human being. And let's briefly examine the human psychic experience for the numinous, which is one of the epiphenomena or hallmarks that archetypes produce in our conscious experience. Not all things in our conscious experience are equal, okay? Some things are more numinous than others. So if you look around where you are right now, you'll notice that your psychic experience is really very clearly structured with objects of varying degrees of numinosity. There is the ground or the floor. There is a sky or a ceiling. There are tables, chairs, books, electrical items, plants, trees, recognizable noises and odours and so on, none of which will be recognizable or meaningful to another biological species. All of these objects are, for a human being, imbued with numinosity, and each have their own set of behaviours and subjective states. For example, if we take the book on a bookcase again, well, you recognise it has meaning to you, different from all the other objects, so it has some degree of numinosity, and the more you like that book, the greater the numinosity. And you know what to do with it. You pick it up, you open it, and you read. Okay, there's a recognised kind of behaviour there. And the strange symbols inside it light up your mind with words and images and feeling states. So we have associated with it as well subjective states. So in short, we have an archetypal experience, that of reading. Of course, it's just reading. We don't recognise it as an archetypal experience because the archetype is firmly in the background of our consciousness, out of our awareness, in the unconscious. The archetype of reading unfolded naturally in the course of your life, just as the leaves, flowers and fruit of a plant unfold. So we wouldn't have noticed it. By reading about archetypes, it's only by reading about archetypes, their key properties of archetypal images, behaviours and subjective states, and by examining your conscious experience and contemplating and reflecting on that, that you can gain an intellectual understanding of the archetypes. So you can come to some kind of awareness, but it's an intellectual awareness, which is not individuation, okay? Individuation is not the intellectual awareness. Intellectual awareness, you could say it's a necessary condition for individuation, but it's not sufficient. So individuation involves an additional stage of ego or personality development, where the person enters into a conscious relationship with the archetypes. So it's a bit like if I read about what it is like having a friend, but I don't have a friend, then I have an intellectual understanding of what friendship's all about. But it's totally different when I actually do have a friend. Then I'm conscious I have a friendship and I'm living it. And that's the same difference between having an intellectual understanding of archetypes and having individuated and being conscious, entering into a conscious relationship with the archetypes. So let's just go back to examining the conscious experience of a human being again. So imagine you are on a train full of strangers, and among them at the other end of the carriage you see your mother. In your conscious experience, your mother will be numinous in a way that the strangers aren't. She'll stand out from the strangers, and you will relate to her as a mother and experience the associated subjective feeling, cognitive states associated with contact with the mother. And you'll notice that all human beings mirror these subjective states and behaviours with a person they call mother. From this you can confidently infer the existence of a mother archetype in the human psyche. The experience of being a human being comes with an inbuilt archetypal relationship to the mother that lasts the entire life. It's this archetype that gives the relationship with the human being that we call mother its influence and meaning. It structures all experiences with the mother, and especially the formative ones. That's not true of the yucca moth, for example, which has no such mother archetype. And a tiger will have a mother archetype, but that archetype unfolds very differently in the life of a tiger. I think mothers just play a role in the early years of a tiger's life. So we can see, in fact, that the human experience is structured to experience a wide range of archetypal relations, not just with the mother, but also with other humans. The father, the sister, brother, cousin, friend, stranger, doctor, priest, wise woman, grandmother, and so on. Each of these archetypal relations with other humans have their own stock of images, behaviours, and subjective states. And in the human experience, in fact, there is more than that. There is a fourth element to the archetype, which is that of stories about archetypal experiences and encounters, such as myths. And these tell us something more about the experiences that these archetypes will bring to our lives, how best to navigate them, and their purpose for us. So they enable us to be much more conscious of these archetypes. So we've built up a picture of the psychic life of a typical human being and how that psychic life is structured. There's clear structure in our perception of and relationship to all the various objects in our environment, and clear structure when it comes to our relationships to other human beings. This structure is archetypal in nature, and we have identified 4 components of the archetype in our conscious experience: the archetypal images, behaviours, subjective states, and stories such as myths. All humans possess this archetypal inheritance, and from the moment we are born, this archetypal inheritance begins to grow and develop, structuring not only our psychic life, but our formative experiences. We can all see how the body grows from a single cell. It grows and lives, enters old age and death, according to a fixed pattern of development. All human bodies grow in basically the same way. So we can see the body grow and develop, just as we can see how an oak tree grows from an acorn, according to a fixed kind of pattern. But unless we have an eye to the inner world, we do not see our archetypal inheritance unfold. Okay, we do not see it. Yet it does. It grows, unfolds, and dies, in just the same way as our bodies do, or an acorn and an oak tree does. And that has importance to astrology, but I'll come back to that in another podcast. But if we think about, for example, the cycles of the moon also mirror the growth of an organism or a plant from a seed right the way through to its death. But that's something I'll come back to in a future episode when I talk about the occult theory of astrology. So this common archetypal inheritance that structures our conscious experience and the formative events of our life, Jung called the collective unconscious. Now, a behavioural biologist may claim that these archetypes have their origin in our DNA and are material in nature and not psychic in nature. Now, Jung was not aware of DNA and genes as they were discovered after his death, about 10-20 years after his death. Had he been aware of them, however, he almost certainly would have rejected them as an explanation for the archetypes for very simple reasons. The archetypes are experienced as a psychic phenomenon. Okay, we experience them in our psyche. DNA is a material phenomenon. Matter, according to the prevailing materialist view, matter is inert, it's mechanical, and it's devoid of any psychic properties whatsoever. Thus, if the archetypes are material in nature like DNA, then they are devoid of any psychic properties, which clearly begs the question, how can they produce psychic phenomena, such as dreams, sensations of touch, sight, thoughts, synchronicities, and so on? We're left with an insoluble paradox, which is equivalent to the so-called hard problem of consciousness. On the other hand, however, if we stick to the fundamental observation that the archetypes are psychic in nature, i.e. that we experience them in our psyche, so they're psychic in nature, then there is no problem in explaining the existence of matter. We know that the archetypes are quite capable of producing the experience of matter because they do so every night in our dreams. We experience matter every night in our dreams. So there is no problem, no paradox in explaining the existence of matter when we take the objective reality of the psyche and its archetypal nature as the fundamental reality and not matter as the fundamental reality. So the world of matter then that we experience as human beings is itself the product of our collective archetypal inheritance, the collective unconscious. This is a radical statement in an age dominated by materialism. And it's an attribute of the archetype that Jung referred to as the psychoid aspect, a very strange word, psychoid aspect. That is, the psychoid aspect of the archetypes refers to the fact that the physical world that we experience is itself a product of our archetypal inheritance. Wow, that's a big statement to make. Jung's collected works could fill a bookshelf, and I've probably just read maybe 20% of those. But what I have read, I'm not aware that Jung gave any evidence really or to back that up, but rather that he intuited it based on loose reasoning, as I have done here, with simple but not conclusive reasoning. So to recap, we have seen how the archetypes not only structure our experience, how we relate to objects and people, the range of behaviours available to us and the various life experiences that we're able to enjoy, but also we have had a glimpse of their role in structuring the reality that we experience, including the experience of solid matter. Now, for most people, the notion of archetypes will be a matter of intellectual interest and not something that they experience directly. That is, the reality of the archetypes, what Jung called the objective existence of the psyche, will remain obscured. Jung, however, described a process of ego or personality development that he termed individuation. Individuation is a process whereby the person comes into a conscious relationship with the archetypal foundations of their psychic life. A direct line of communication is established, and this is known in the Jungian tradition as the ego-self axis. Now recall that my purpose in introducing the Jungian notion of the archetypes, their psychoid aspect, and the process of individuation was so that we have a shared conceptual toolkit with which I can explain what the goal of yoga, the attainment of direct seeing, is, and to describe a bit more about it, to demystify it and bring it into the modern mind. So let me now do that. So let us turn to yoga. The final attainment of yoga is the attainment of direct seeing. This is when reality is perceived directly. So at present, regardless of what our intellectual views are, whether we are a materialist or we believe that things are psychic in nature, regardless of whether we have individuated or not, and regardless of whether we are intuitives or someone who works with spirits or so on, regardless of all that, at present we all perceive reality as if it were materially real. That is, we perceive the world as though it were made of inherently real matter, matter which is inert and possesses no psychic properties. And by psychic properties, I'm talking about memories, feelings, intentions, and so on. We perceive this matter as giving rise to our consciousness. And again, we may have read books that convince us otherwise, and we may have had many spiritual experiences that convince us that the world is spiritual in nature. But that does not alter our fundamental biological perception of reality. That is, our experience that our senses show us is a world of physically real matter. Now, that experience of the world has its roots in an archetype. The goal of yoga is to transform that archetype through practices unique to yoga and which themselves unfold from an archetype, which we can call the archetype of yoga. an archetypal potential that all humans possess. When that transformation has occurred, we perceive reality directly. That is, we directly perceive reality as psychoid in nature. That is the attainment of direct seeing. Now, let's look at what that means, okay, like a corollary of that. So, firstly, once you perceive the world directly in its psychoid and not its material aspect, then you are able to perceive directly that your conscious experience continues after the death of the body, just as your conscious experiences continue after you wake up from a dream. And again, that's not a belief, it's a direct perception. You perceive the cyclical nature of conscious existence cycling through life after life. Secondly, you are able to perceive directly how actions in past incarnations have had an influence on your current experience, and how actions in your current experience are likely to influence future experiences. So you have a vision that is able to transcend the individual life. And again, it's not an intellectual view, it's a direct seeing. Thirdly, in this manner you are able ultimately to enter a state free from the archetypal causes of suffering and to control the manner of future incarnations, which are currently not under your control. So you currently don't have the ability to control not having your next life as a factory farmed chicken, for example. And this is why the attainment of direct seeing is also known as liberation. Okay, the liberation refers to liberation from the perception of a material existence and the deluded minds and actions that spring from that, and which act as the cause for future lives of suffering. And the term enlightenment originally refers just to the fact that you are now perceiving the world directly in its psychoid aspect and not in its material aspect. So it's as though you have been awakened, which is what enlightenment means. And again, I don't use the words enlightenment and liberation. I stick with the attainment of direct seeing because it's not loaded with misinformation and hubris and cultural kind of baggage. Now, let me say a little bit more about direct seeing before I finish. One of the few myths of our modern culture that everyone is likely familiar with is the biblical Garden of Eden myth, and in particular the temptation where Adam and Eve partook of the fruit offered to them by the serpent and as a result fell into states of suffering. Life contains many pleasures, and mostly, just like Adam and Eve, we consume them unaware of their spiritual consequences for future lives. For example, would the world still be consuming fossil fuels and polluting the biosphere if everyone knew that it would be they, in future incarnations, and not some other generation, who will reap the consequences for potentially many hundreds of lives? The answer is clearly no. Suddenly everyone would have a very strong interest in looking after the world and living sustainably, knowing full well that they will be the ones living in it life after life. And we could also ask ourselves, would we wage war and oppress our neighbours if we knew that we were creating the conditions for us to experience something similar in future lives? Again, the answer is no, we wouldn't. Our collective psychic inheritance contains many dark and malevolent archetypal potentials. Okay, the psychoid archetypal world that we live in, but which we perceive as material reality, is seeded with their fruit. And when we consume that fruit, we activate that archetypal potential, which constellates and begins to unfold. These malefic archetypes, when fully developed, bring experience of suffering. And these archetypes will unfold life after life and give rise to cycles of suffering that extend across just the one life. A really simple example is refined sugar. That is one such poisoned apple which, when consumed regularly, will ripen a malevolent archetype that will bring suffering, perhaps not in this life, but for many lives thereafter. Many of the goods we regularly consume are all examples of poisoned fruit, meat, alcohol, tobacco, caffeine, non-organic veg, and so on. While we're trapped in the perception of a material world, we are unable to distinguish the true nature of the objects in our experience, and thus we're caught in a cycle of suffering, life after life. And remember, this is regardless of our views, whether we believe that reality is non-material in nature, whether we've individuated and understand that reality is psychoid in nature, or whether we're a spiritual type who communes with spirits and understand that the world is spiritual in nature. Regardless of all of that, our senses still perceive reality as materially real, and that means we are unable to distinguish the true nature of the objects in our experience. All of those people who I've just mentioned will all probably consume meat or alcohol or tobacco or caffeine or non-organic veg or pursue harmful goals because they're unable to distinguish the true nature of the objects in their experience, and they're unable to see how this is going to cause them suffering in future lives. So it's only with the attainment of direct seeing that one can perceive the archetypal psychoid nature of reality and thus discern the true nature of things, such as whether an object is the fruit of a malevolent mind, as, for example, refined sugar is. That is the goal of yoga, and that is the result of attaining direct seeing. Now, I mentioned that yoga is an archetype that unfolds from your own being as a result of your own actions, and in that sense, practicing authentic yoga is not a choice that anyone can make. It's something that unfolds in your life and that you become aware of, and it will bring with it meditation, teachings, new ways of living and relating, realizations, and ultimately the attainment of direct seeing, enabling you to see directly the nature of reality. And because yoga unfolds from an archetype, one necessary condition that the archetype of yoga requires for its unfolding is that the individual has individuated. Without this condition in place, authentic yoga, the attainment of direct seeing, is not possible. It is only the individuated personality that can commune consciously with an archetype. Without that condition, how can one be guided into yogic attainments by the archetype itself? One cannot. Thus, individuation is a necessary condition. And by individuation, I don't mean you have to be a Jungian, only that you have established an ego-self axis of some sort. So that could be done through astrology, for example. In fact, astrology, I would consider that quite a sophisticated ego-self axis. And while individuation is a necessary condition for the unfolding of yoga, it is not sufficient. There are other conditions required for the unfolding of yoga, and those are things that I will go into in a future podcast. So I've used the Jungian notions of archetype, psychoid and individuation to explain as clearly as I can the goal of yoga. I hope it's been illuminating. Now, I want to finish off by mentioning a difference, mentioning one aspect of yoga which makes yoga unique. Okay, so I mentioned before that Jung did not give any detailed evidence for the psychoid nature of reality. In other words, that reality is psychic in nature, like a dream world, but rather he intuited it based upon loose kind of reasoning, as I have here. Jung did not practice yoga, and he had not attained direct seeing. Now, because direct seeing is the ultimate goal of yoga, then authentic yoga that derives from the archetype itself contains detailed teachings on the psychoid nature of reality, and it is through studying and contemplating these teachings that one's sensory experience is transformed and one attains direct seeing. So they are a vital component of yoga. Now, they're not teachings about the archetypes, they're teachings about the nature of reality. The fact that, well, I'll leave it there. So on my website, www.yoga aquarian-age.co.uk is a section containing writings on yoga. One section is called The Nature of Things, is a complete set of teachings on the nature of reality that can guide the mind to the attainment of direct seeing, provided, of course, the archetype of yoga is unfolding within you. If it's not, it will just be a matter of intellectual interest. Another section, entitled The Ultimate Search, is a series of dialogues, a series of Socratic-style dialogues that are an essential companion to the set of essays contained in The Nature of Things. So I refer the interested listener there. And I should say, regarding the website, that the website started out as a place for me to store my photos. I didn't have an idea of turning it into a public website. So it's only later that I altered it, changing the website name and adding some writings on yoga. So the photos are available to buy as prints, but I make no money from that. That's just a money-earning tool for the company that run the hosting. And I can't turn it off. If I could turn it off, I would. It's an inbuilt feature of the website. I assume it enables them to provide cheap hosting. So it has nothing to do with me, and I make no money from it, and if I could turn it off, I would. So I just feel I need to clarify that in case you think I'm doing this to sell photos. Okay, that's not the aim. The aim of the website is to store my photos and also to make available my writings on yoga. No more than that. Now we have come to the end of the podcast. I hope it has been illuminating. Be safe, and I will speak again soon.